57 years. Longer than the marriage it was built to protect. Longer than most military careers. Longer than some of the countries that existed when it started. One woman fought a war that outlasted every battle her husband ever rode into. She fought it without a single weapon he would have recognized. No cavalry, no carbines, no golden hair catching the light at the head of a charge. She fought with ink and grief, and the one rule of 19th century society that no man dared break. You do not attack a widow. July 1876. A Parlor Floor in North Dakota. A woman has just learned that her husband is dead. That 3 of his brothers are dead. That 210 soldiers who followed him are dead. That every plan she made for the rest of her life has been erased by a battle on a ridge she will never see. She is on the floor. She is making sounds that have no words in them. Officers stand above her and cannot look down. And then she does the thing that will define the next half-century of American memory. She stops crying. She stands up. She straightens her dress. And she walks outside into the Dakota morning and goes door to door through Officers' Row to tell 14 other women that their husbands are never coming home. She had been a widow for less than 1 hour. She would remain one for 57 years. And in those years, she would rewrite the story of America's worst military disaster so completely that the truth would need a prairie fire and a metal detector to dig its way back out. To understand what happened in that parlor, you need to know what happened in a house in Michigan 20 years earlier. Elizabeth Bacon grew up in Monroe, a town small enough that your neighbors knew your grief before the doctor left your porch. Her father was a judge. The house was comfortable. The family should have been safe. But the diseases of 19th century childhood did not consult the social register. Diphtheria came first, then scarlet fever. Libby lost a sibling, then another, then a third. She was not yet 8 years old, and she had already stood beside 3 graves dug into Michigan earth that was still frozen when the first child died in February, and soft with spring rain when the second died in April, and hard with summer heat when the third followed before the leaves turned. The rituals became familiar before she was old enough to understand them. The closed curtains, the mirror covered with black cloth, the neighbors arriving with food that no one ate, the sound of her mother crying at night through walls that were too thin for privacy and too thick for comfort. Her mother held the family together through each loss with a composure that Libby absorbed the way a child absorbs language, not through instruction, through exposure, through watching the way her mother's hands stayed steady pouring tea the morning after burying a child, through noticing that her mother's voice never broke in public even when her eyes said it had broken somewhere private hours before. Then her mother died. Libby was 12. The woman who had taught her how to survive loss was now the loss she had to survive. Judge Bacon raised his daughter alone after that. He was rigid, proper, a man who believed that a straight spine and a controlled face could substitute for the warmth that had left the house when his wife stopped breathing. Libby learned his lesson too. She learned both lessons. From her mother, she learned that you hold the people around you together no matter what is falling apart. From her father, she learned that you never let anyone see the cost. Those 2 lessons would carry her through the next 70 years, through a marriage to the most reckless officer in the American Army, through frontier posts where women died alone, through a morning in Dakota when she walked door to door delivering news that would have destroyed anyone who had not already been destroyed and rebuilt before the age of 13. George Armstrong Custer arrived in Monroe on leave in 1862, looking like something a war novel had invented and abandoned on the street. Golden hair past his shoulders. A uniform he had apparently designed himself, heavy on velvet and light on regulation. A laugh that filled rooms and a confidence so total it either attracted you completely or repelled you on contact. He was 22. He had graduated last in his class at West Point. a distinction that should have buried his career before it started. Instead, the Civil War had turned his recklessness into a resume. He charged when other men calculated. He survived when probability said he should not. By 23, he was a general, the youngest in the Union Army. Libby married him in February 1864. Her father had objected. Custer drank. Custer gambled. Custer had a reputation with women that Monroe gossip had catalogued with a thoroughness that would have impressed a detective. Judge Bacon saw a young man running on charm and luck, two currencies that eventually run out. He was not wrong about any of it, but Libby chose George the way she chose everything. With her eyes open and her spine straight, and a certainty that came from somewhere deeper than logic. She was not naive about his flaws. She was specific about what mattered more. His energy, his devotion when he was present. The way he made every room feel like the most important room in the world, simply by being in it. She would spend 57 years defending that choice against evidence that grew heavier with every decade. The frontier years taught her what the choice actually cost. She followed George to posts in Kansas and Dakota Territory, where comfort was a memory and danger was the weather. Rattlesnakes appeared in tents without announcement. Temperatures dropped to 40 below in winters that lasted from October to April, cold so intense that water froze in canteens hung around soldiers' necks, and horses died standing up in the night. In summer, the heat reversed, pushing past 100 on treeless plains, where the only shade was the shadow your own body cast on the ground. She learned to cook on an iron stove that weighed more than she did, and required fuel that sometimes consisted of dried buffalo chips, because there was no wood within a day's ride. She learned to shoot a pistol because the nearest help might be a week away, and the sounds that woke her at 2 in the morning might be coyotes, or might be something that required a loaded weapon and steady hands. She watched women she cared about die in childbirth on dirt floors, at posts where the surgeon was a man whose primary qualification was owning a set of instruments. She buried their children beside them, in graves that the spring thaw would shift and the summer grass would cover. And through it all she wrote, not complaints, observations, letters to George that were funny and detailed and alive with the voice of a woman who refused to let the frontier make her dull. Letters to family in Michigan that made the West sound like an adventure rather than the slow, grinding endurance test it actually was. She was practicing, learning the craft of selecting which details to share and which to keep in the dark. She would need that craft more than she could have imagined. The anxiety of separation ran in both directions across hundreds of miles of territory where a letter took weeks to arrive, and silence could mean anything from a delayed mail rider to the worst thing a spouse can imagine. In 1867, Custer found the answer to what silence sometimes meant. Lieutenant Kidder and 10 soldiers, dead on the Kansas plains, killed carrying dispatches, the bodies stripped and left in the tall grass where the flies found them before the army did. The sight broke something in him, not his courage, his ability to tolerate not knowing. Every day without a letter from Libby was a day he spent building nightmares in his head about what might be happening at the post he had left her to defend alone. The image of Kidder's men was the nightmare made real, made physical, made unavoidable. He abandoned his post, left his command on the Kansas plains where soldiers were dying, and rode 150 miles through country where warriors had killed men the previous week. He rode through the night. He rode through heat that killed horses. He changed mounts at relay stations and kept going. He did not request permission. He did not send a telegram. He did not inform his second-in-command or leave written orders or do any of the things a responsible officer does before departing his post during active operations. He simply left because the fear of losing Libby had become larger than his fear of losing his career. The Army's response was predictable and correct. Court-martial, guilty on multiple charges including conduct prejudicial to good order and military discipline and absence without leave from command. Suspended 1 year without pay. His career appeared finished, but when General Sheridan needed someone insane enough to attack a Cheyenne winter camp, he called Custer back. Libby called the reunion one long, perfect day. A man who threw away his career to ride 150 miles to see her. She would build her entire defense of his legacy on that moment. The proof that underneath the golden hair and the velvet and the recklessness was a man whose love ran deeper than his judgment. It was a beautiful story. It was also the story of a man who abandoned soldiers in hostile territory because his personal anxiety outweighed his professional duty. Both versions are true. Libby chose 1 November 1868, the Washita River, Oklahoma Territory. Custer led the 7th Cavalry in a dawn attack on Black Kettle's Cheyenne village. What happened in the next 2 hours resists any single telling. Warriors killed, women killed, elders killed, 800 horses shot to prevent pursuit, the screaming of the animals carrying across the frozen river for hours. Among the captured was Washita, daughter of a chief. Her relationship with Custer would fuel controversy that has never been resolved, and that Libby would spend decades refusing to acknowledge. In the aftermath, soldiers found Clara Blinn, a white woman taken captive months earlier, dead. Beside her, an infant son, also dead. The November wind carried the smoke from burning teepees across the river, where Cheyenne survivors wailed for their own dead, in a sound that several soldiers said they heard in their sleep for years. The Washita was a rehearsal for everything that would come later. Not the battle itself, the storytelling. Custer wrote about the Washita in My Life on the Plains, shaping the narrative while the gunpowder smell was still in his clothes. Libby watched him choose which details to keep and which to bury. The attack became a victory. The dead women became an unfortunate consequence. The captured Washita became a footnote. She watched her husband construct a version of events that served his career, and she learned something that neither of them ever named out loud. The truth is not what happened. The truth is what the person holding the pen decides happened. A well-chosen detail illuminates. A well-omitted detail protects. George understood this instinctively. He had the storyteller's gift for knowing which moments to amplify and which to leave in shadow. The attack on the Washita became a victory in his prose. The dead women became an unfortunate consequence of a war they did not start. The captured Washita became a footnote so small you could miss her between paragraphs. Libby watched and learned. She would apply that lesson for 57 years with a discipline George never achieved. George had 8 years to build his legend. Libby had 57, and she was better at it than he was because she had something he never had: patience. The patience of a woman who had buried 3 siblings and a mother and learned that the only things that survive are the things you are willing to protect every single day for the rest of your life. Spring 1876. Fort Abraham Lincoln. The morning the 7th Cavalry rode out for the last time. Libby stood on the parade ground with the other wives and watched the column form. Horses stamping, guidons snapping, the clank of equipment, and the low murmur of 600 men who had said their goodbyes and were now thinking about the trail ahead. The column moved out into a mist that hung over the Dakota plain like gauze. And then something happened that Libby would describe in every book she wrote and every lecture she gave for the rest of her life. The regiment's reflection appeared above it, in the mist. Riders and horses and wagons reproduced in the air as if a second column was climbing toward the sky. A ghost regiment marching upward into the clouds, while the living regiment marched west into the grass. Nobody on the parade ground spoke. The wives stood together in silence, watching the phantom column rise and dissolve as the mist burned off, and the real column grew smaller on the horizon. Libby told herself it meant nothing. She told herself it was light and moisture and the tricks that distance plays on the eyes. She told herself these things for 57 years and never once believed them. The mist cleared. The column disappeared. George rode north toward the Little Bighorn. Libby stayed. She would never see him again. The next sound from that direction would be a knock on her door at dawn and a chaplain who could not meet her eyes. June 25, 1876. Custer divided the 7th Cavalry into 3 groups and sent them against a village that contained between 7,000 and 10,000 Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho families, children. Warriors who were defending their homes on land the United States government had guaranteed them in a treaty it had already broken. Reno's 140 men charged the southern end and were shattered in minutes. Thrown back across the river, survivors clawing up the bluffs, Custer took 210 men north along the ridge. Into a force that outnumbered him several times over, Crazy Horse swept around from the north. Gall drove up from the south. Warriors with Winchester repeaters closed from every direction on soldiers carrying single-shot Springfields that jammed in the heat. In less than 1 hour, 210 men died, every one of them George. His brother Tom, who had earned 2 Medals of Honor in the Civil War and was identified only by a tattoo because his face was gone. His brother Boston, who had come along because the Custers treated campaigns the way other families treated holidays. His nephew Autty Reed. His brother-in-law James Calhoun. 5 members of one family. Gone in an afternoon that started with heat and dust and ended with silence. The kind of silence that a battlefield produces when the shooting stops and the wind picks up, and the only sounds left are horses wandering riderless through the grass and crows beginning to circle overhead. Libby would never know what George's last minutes looked like. No survivor could tell her. No letter could describe it. She would spend 57 years constructing those minutes from imagination and need, building a version of his death that she could endure, because the alternative, that he died confused and afraid in a disaster he had created, was a thought that would have ended her. The news took 11 days to reach Fort Lincoln. 11 days of silence, during which Libby and the other wives waited and hoped, and told each other that silence was normal on the frontier. Silence was always normal. Until it was not. She opened the door. She saw the chaplain. She fell. She wept. She stood up. And then she did something that no one asked her to do, and no protocol required. She walked. Through Officers' Row. Door to door. 14 houses. 14 wives. The first door was the hardest, because she had to start. The last door was the hardest, because she had to finish. Every door between was a woman she had eaten dinner with, shared fears with, laughed with on summer evenings, when the plains stretched golden to the horizon, and the frontier felt almost kind. She knocked. The door opened. She watched a face that had been composed for an ordinary morning come apart in front of her, the way a reflection comes apart when you drop a stone into still water. The sound each woman made was different. Some screamed, some went silent, in a way that was worse than screaming, because silence meant the grief had gone somewhere too deep for sound to follow. Some asked questions, some already knew and asked nothing. One woman reportedly fainted before Libby finished the first sentence. Another grabbed Libby's hands and would not let go, holding on to the messenger as if the messenger was the last connection to the world that had existed 5 minutes earlier. Maggie Custer, Tom's wife, George's sister-in-law, the woman who had sat across from Libby at 100 dinners and complained about the same bad coffee, and worried about the same absent husbands, and shared the same frontier fears that only another cavalry wife could understand. Maggie opened the door and saw Libby's face, and her hands went to her mouth, and she made a sound that was not a word and not a scream, but something between them that Libby would hear in her sleep for the rest of her life. She did not ask which brother. She asked how many. All of them, Libby said. George, Tom, Boston, Audie Reed. James, all of them. The word all hung in the morning air between two women who had just lost everything they shared. The walk took less than an hour. The distance was nothing. A few hundred yards of packed dirt between wooden houses. But Libby covered that distance carrying a weight that had nothing to do with her body. She was carrying 14 versions of her own grief, delivering it to women whose lives she was shattering with a composure that she maintained by sheer force, because stopping was not something she knew how to do. Her mother had taught her that. Her dead siblings had taught her that. The judge with the rigid spine had taught her that. You keep walking. You knock on the next door. You hold the next woman. And you do not sit down until the duty is finished. Somewhere between the first door and the last, Libby made a decision that would define the next half-century of American memory. She would not let this morning be the end of the story. She would make it the beginning of a different one. A story in which George died a hero. A story worth 57 years of fighting. A story worth every door she had just walked through and every face she had just watched break. George left her nothing except debt and duty. The army pay stopped the day he died. An insurance policy had lapsed because George, who could charge a Confederate battery without blinking, could not be bothered to mail a premium payment on time. There would be no payout. She owed creditors money George had borrowed and spent on equipment for the campaign that killed him. She was responsible for his elderly parents, who had lost 3 sons in a single afternoon and had no income and no savings and no one left to care for them except the daughter-in-law, who was herself penniless. "He has left them to me as a final legacy," she wrote, and the sentence carries the weight of a woman who has added 2 more dependents to a grief that was already crushing her. By 1880, she had negotiated every creditor down to 10 cents on the dollar. A feat of financial nerve performed by a woman the world expected to sit in black and weep quietly. She did not sit quietly. She could have retreated, mourned privately, disappeared into the quiet anonymity available to 19th century widows who chose obscurity over exposure. She chose exposure. She declared war on every officer, every historian, every journalist who suggested that George Armstrong Custer had gotten his men killed through arrogance and incompetence. Her weapons were precise. She wrote Boots and Saddles in 1885, not a military history, a love story set on the frontier. George as husband, dog lover, practical joker, devoted friend. The man behind the uniform. Readers fell in love with him because Libby made them fall in love with him the way she had fallen in love with him, through the details that made him human rather than the decisions that made him dead. Tenting on the Plains followed in 1887, following the Guidon in 1890. Each book named officers who had questioned George. An officer criticized by name in a best-selling memoir written by a grieving widow could not respond without looking petty, could not publish his own account without appearing to attack a woman in black. The books were not memoirs. They were weapons aimed at specific targets by a woman who understood that reputation is just another word for the story most people believe. Then she took the stage. From the 1890s onward, Libby lectured across America in theaters and church halls and veterans gatherings. Small, composed, standing alone on platforms in cities where no one knew her face, but everyone knew her name, dressed in the black she would wear every day for 57 years. Not the heavy mourning black of the early years, but a refined, elegant black that said, "This is not costume, this is who I am." Her voice trembled at the moments she chose. Her pauses landed where she placed them. She wept when weeping served the narrative, and stopped weeping when stopping served it better. Audiences who came expecting a sad old woman left having met the most disciplined performer they had ever seen. She told the story of the Phantom Regiment, and strong men wept. She told the story of the 14 doors and women gripped each other's hands. She told the story of George riding 150 miles to see her, and the room went silent with a tenderness that felt like church. She was not performing grief. She was conducting it the way a general conducts a battle, every movement calculated, every emotion deployed at the precise moment it would cause maximum impact. Reno requested a court of inquiry in 1879. Libby attended. She sat in the gallery in black and did not speak and did not need to. Her presence was the verdict the court was afraid to contradict. Officers testified carefully, each word chosen to avoid the appearance of attacking a grieving woman. The inquiry cleared Reno of cowardice, but left the larger question of blame exactly where Libby wanted it. Nowhere near George. She outlived every officer who served at Little Bighorn, every single one. She died on April 4, 1933, at 57 years after the battle. By then, the myth was so deep in American culture that questioning it felt like questioning a religion. Then the ground spoke. In the 1980s, a prairie fire cleared the grass off the battlefield, and archaeologists arrived with metal detectors. They mapped every cartridge casing across the ridge, where 210 men had died. Each casing carried a signature, firing pin marks unique to individual weapons, extractor grooves. The forensic team could track specific guns across the field, see where they were fired, where they moved, where they stopped, and the casings showed soldiers moving backward, retreating, scattering. The warrior casings showed the opposite, forward, closing distance, methodically. The brass told a story that 57 years of books and lectures and weaponized widowhood had buried. The soldiers on that ridge did not die in an organized last stand. They died running, scattered across 3 miles of broken ground, unfired cartridges clutched in dead hands, no defensive circle, no heroic perimeter, panic, disintegration, and Lakota and Cheyenne voices, ignored for a century, finally heard. Families were in that camp. Children were swimming in the river when the soldiers came. The warriors who rode out to meet Custer were not aggressors. They were fathers defending their sons. Libby's version was not the truth. But here is the thing that lifts this story above a case study in media manipulation and makes it something more human and more painful. She may have known the divisions among the 7th's officers that George had caused and worsened through favoritism and arrogance. The questions about Washita that followed George from the Washita to his grave and beyond. The letters from subordinates that accused him of recklessness so extreme it constituted a death wish. The cold mathematical fact that dividing 600 men into 3 groups against 2,000 warriors on unscouted ground was not a tactical decision. It was a suicide note written in troop deployments. She almost certainly knew all of it. She was not a fool. She was the sharpest person in most rooms she entered, and she had spent 12 years watching her husband make decisions that terrified everyone except him. She knew, and she chose the story she could live inside for 57 years, not the truth. The love. Because the truth would have destroyed her, and the love, however incomplete, however selective, however carefully edited, was the only thing strong enough to hold her upright through 14 doors and 57 years, and the slow realization that the man she had devoted her life to defending may not have deserved the defense she gave him. She is buried beside George at West Point, the same man she married in Monroe, the same man who rode 150 miles through enemy territory to see her, the same man who led 210 soldiers into a valley and never rode out. In the end, she got what she fought for. They are together, and the story, for better and for worse, is still partly hers. She was not a footnote to George Armstrong Custer. He was a chapter in hers, and she wrote it herself, in ink that took a century to fade, and brass that will never lie.